We're finally going to talk about Darwin. Are you excited? Because I am. I know it took us a little bit to get here and talk about Darwin in the first place, but it's important to remember the context and where people come from. So we're going to talk a little bit about Darwin's context and his background. Darwin is undoubtedly the best known figure if you're talking about evolution. He went to some pretty cool places and he came up with some pretty cool theories that really kickstarted the entire field of evolutionary biology and changed how we view the natural world forever. So, when we're talking about Darwin, there's a couple things we're going to have to talk about. We're going to start talking about his background, then we'll talk about his hypotheses and what he drew based from his travels. Then we'll talk about artificial selection, a specific example he used to explain his theories. And lastly, we'll talk about Alfred Russel Wallace and why we're talking about this guy that most people haven't heard of. So, Darwin, where did he come from? Darwin lived in the 1800s, and he actually first studied medicine. That's where he learned taxidermy, but he couldn't quite hack it in medical school. He eventually dropped out and he ended up in the seminary for a while. So it's a little interesting that he had so many religious teachings and eventually came up with a completely different theory. But keep in mind the time period in which he lived. One of the things that was very popular around this time was beetle collecting. There are so many beetles out in the world, and most of them are actually really beautiful. And one of the things they liked to do was naturalists would go out in the world and collect cool and interesting things. And at the time, beetles were one of the most popular. And because there are so many beetles, this is a great introduction into just the diversity of life and how many different species there are out there. Darwin also came from a good family, so he went to school and he got to study a lot of different things. He studied many of the names we talked about last lecture. He studied the theories of Lamarck, Lyell and Hutton in geology, Malthus and being worried about population growth, Adam Smith and his theories of economics and the invisible hand of the market, Comte de Buffon noticing there's this link between the environment and variation that we see between different species. Cuvier and Saint-Hilaire looking at comparative anatomy and debating what the causes are between those. So after Darwin studied all of these things, he had the opportunity to join the Voyage of the Beagle. This was a 5-year trip between 1831 and 1836. And his official role was to be the gentleman amateur naturalist, but also really the gentleman companion for the captain of this ship, Robert Fitzroy. This was a fairly classist society at this time in England, and the captain of the ship had a higher social status than the crewmen, so he needed like an official and higher status companion. And whatever you think of that, it did give Darwin the opportunity to join this voyage and travel around the world. You can see on this map several of the different places they visited. Of course, the most famous is the Galapagos, but they went around the southern tip of South America, and they also went around South Africa as well and hit some places in Australia and New Zealand. So this is much more than the Galapagos, even though that is where his most famous conjectures were drawn from. So let's talk about the Galapagos. Of course, the most famous are probably Darwin's finches. And you can see with this example here, there are a lot of different finches, and they look very different and have many different forms. At the time, Darwin just noticed that there were a bunch of different birds. He didn't actually notice they were finches yet because he wasn't an expert in birds. So what he did is he collected many of these and brought them home to some of his friends at the British National Museum. And it was at that point an ornithologist pointed out, like, whoa, these are all finches. That's really weird. No one before had seen such a diversity of finches. It was very strange to find things that were both so dissimilar, but also so similar. Another thing that Darwin looked at was the tortoises in the Galapagos. He noticed there was a couple different shell shapes, but they were consistently patterned. On lush islands or islands with a lot of greenery and other plant life, you would find dome-shaped shells. But on arid islands that were much drier, didn't have as much plant life, you would find tortoises with saddle-shaped shells. Let's look at some bigger pictures so they make a little bit more sense. Also, you can see just how big some of these guys are. So this dome shape, it's really just a dome and it's actually quite low over the back of their head. So they can't actually really do much with their head and it's kind of kept low to the ground. But these saddle-shaped shells, it has a little bit of a thing over their neck so they can reach up their neck and notice how long their neck is too. So this guy can crane in all sorts of directions and reach more places with his head and neck. Now, think back to the environments we just said they were in. On these lush islands, there is so much food everywhere, and it's okay if their movement of the head is restricted because they can still reach enough food down on the ground. But on these arid islands, the tortoises need that range of motion so they can reach as many different places as possible to reach food because there isn't as much available. So these are some of the beginnings of what Darwin is noticing to develop his theories about evolution. So, what were some aspects of Darwin's background, and how did that influence his later theories?